The bell rang once, low and hollow, and the sound seemed to hang in the damp night air like a rope swaying above an unseen abyss. It was not the call of morning prayer, nor the toll for celebration, but the heavy groan that carried sorrow across rooftops and fields. Each stroke pressed itself against the timbered walls of the village, sliding into the gaps where smoke seeped from shuttered hearths. In the alleyways, the stones glistened with last night's rain, slick with filth, and the bitter smell of tanners' vats clung to the air, mingling with the sweet acrid bite of ash from dying fires. A dog, lean and sharp-ribbed, rooted through scraps of refuse, the wet sound of its tongue on bone echoing against the silence. Above, a wooden shutter creaked back and forth, moaning like a weary spirit. This was the music of medieval life: hunger, cold, and the endless companionship of death. Within a hut of wattle and daub, its thatch heavy with dew, a woman lay awake. She did not stir, for the act of moving risked disturbing the fragile sleep of her children. Yet one of them, the youngest, was already restless, his cough tearing through the night like cloth rent by unseen hands. The sound pierced her, sharp as an arrow, each ragged breath reminding her of the slow siege death laid upon her house. She had walked the muddy road to the parish priest, had knelt with coins in trembling hands before the altar, had whispered prayers into the flickering glow of votive candles. Still the illness clung as if sanctity itself had turned its gaze away. She remembered the midwife's whispered warning, spoken in a tone lower than the tolling bell. The air itself is foul. The rot rides in on breath and damp. Holy water cannot wash away what seeps into the lungs. The woman tightened her grip on the woolen blanket drawn up to her chin, its coarse weave scratching her skin. She closed her eyes, yet all she saw was the image of a small grave, stones laid hastily at its edge, a wooden cross splintering in the cold. She fought the vision, tried to replace it with another, the smell of baking bread, the warmth of sun on a meadow. But the cough rose again, harsher now, demanding to be heard above hope. Beyond her fragile walls, the village began to stir. Bakers were the first, rising in the bitter dark, their hands cracked and raw as they kneaded barley dough mixed with what little wheat they could afford. The scent of flour and yeast, so faint it barely broke the stench of tanneries and pigs, drifted slowly into the lanes. The bell would call them soon, not for prayer but for labor, for bread was more precious than blessings, and the ledger of survival was written in loaves. Each loaf measured against tax, against tithe, against toll. Life was a contract signed, daily with hunger. Men woke next, shouldering tools of iron dulled by years of use. Plows, mattocks, hammers, all cold to the touch, all waiting to strip flesh from bone as much as to shape the land. A cart creaked into motion, its wheel groaning like the throat of the dying. Somewhere a woman drew water from the village well, her bucket splashing back echoes that had lived there for generations. And all the while the bell marked time. One sound for waking, another for labor, another for death. The woman rose at last, though the weight of dread pressed heavily upon her. She wrapped her child in a blanket and lifted him, his breath rattling against her chest. His small hand clutched at her shift, his skin damp with fever. She stepped into the lane, mud clinging instantly to her boots, the mist rising low as if the earth itself exhaled grief. Neighbors passed in silence, their eyes cast downward. They did not ask, for all knew what it meant to carry a child swaddled at dawn. Some would not see him again. At the edge of the village, the church loomed, stone walls damp with moss, its door black with years of soot and hands pressed in supplication. She pushed the door open, the iron hinges screaming like souls in purgatory. Inside, the smell of wax and mildew mingled with incense burned too thin. She laid her child at the foot of the altar, where shadows danced upon painted saints whose eyes seemed to avert themselves. The priest emerged, heavy with vestments, his lips moving in Latin she could not understand. She clutched the hem of her cloak and whispered her own words. Not the grand petitions of Scripture, but the simple, silent bargaining of a mother. The ritual unfolded, yet she felt no miracle stir the air. The child shivered, his breath whistling, and she thought of the many graves that ringed the churchyard. crosses tilting, earth sinking, names already worn smooth by rain. Death did not come with the grandeur of kings or the drama of battle. It came with the cough of children, the silence of mothers, the toll of a bell. Still she prayed. For what else was left to her but the act of prayer? She prayed for the strength to carry him home if he did not rise, for the patience to watch him fade if no cure came, for the endurance to wake tomorrow to the same hunger, the same toil, the same smoke and mud. She prayed until her lips cracked dry, until her voice was lost among the echo of chants. When the ritual ended, she gathered her child and stepped again into the gray morning. The mist had thickened, cloaking the cottages in veils of pale sorrow. The villagers bent to their tasks, hands black with soil, shoulders stooped with unending debt. Life continued not because it was merciful, but because it had no other shape. The woman walked slowly down the lane, each step heavy, each breath uncertain, the sound of the bell following her like a shadow she could never outrun, and as the bell tolled again, higher this time, as if pleading against the silence, another door creaked open and another mother stepped forth carrying her own child into the mist. The village did not pause. The day had begun. The cycle would turn again. Hunger, prayer, labor, loss, all woven together like the rough woolen blanket pressed against a mother's cheek, damp with the breath of a fevered child. The world of the living pressed forward, but in the stillness of that moment, in the mist that wrapped the village, one could feel the deeper truth rising like smoke, that survival in this age was not the conquest of men, nor the glory of kingdoms, but the quiet endurance of those who bore grief in silence and still rose to walk again. And in that silence, in that slow tolling of the bell, the shadows seemed to whisper of what was yet to come, of famine and fire, of plague that would sweep not only the children but the villages themselves. For in the medieval world, suffering was not a passing season. It was the air itself. It was the soil. It was the dark inheritance of all who lived beneath the toll of that eternal bell. The lantern flickered against the monastery's cold stone, its flame trembling as if it too feared the silence. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of mortar that never dried, with beeswax half-burned in brass holders, with the faint metallic sting of blood drifting from the infirmary where the sick lay in shadows. Along the cloister hall, a novice walked with slow steps, his sandals whispering against the flagstones, carrying a basin of water that sloshed quietly in his trembling hands. His face was pale, framed by the hood of his coarse wool habit, his breath shallow as though he feared to disturb the endless hush of the walls. The night pressed close around him, but what he feared most was not the darkness. It was the door. The door at the end of the passage, thick oak bound with blackened iron, its hinges as wide as his forearm, its bolts scarred by years of hammering shut. Behind it, faint cries rose and fell, half prayer, half agony. He had been told never to glance at it, never to wonder what sanctity demanded of men who stumbled. Yet his ears betrayed him, pulling him closer with every echo of suffering that escaped like incense through the cracks. This monastery, perched high on a wind-torn hill, seemed to touch the sky, its towers like fingers of stone raised toward heaven. From the village below, it was seen as a fortress of prayer, a beacon of holiness where men traded their lives of toil for a lifetime of devotion. Farmers bent under their loads would climb the hill to offer grain. Mothers brought their children to kneel for blessings. Soldiers left coins heavy with blood guilt on the altar, hoping for forgiveness. But within these walls, silence was not peace. It was the weight of obedience, the shroud of secrets, the echo of punishment muffled beneath the chants. In the scriptorium, quills scratched endlessly, filling parchment with lines of scripture, the ink smelling faintly of iron and oak gall. In the kitchens, the sharp reek of salted fish clung to stone, filling the bellies of brothers who dared not complain. And in hidden rooms, unseen by pilgrims and peasants alike, other tools lay ready. The rope stiff with use, the rod polished by repetition, the iron links coiled like serpents awaiting command. Discipline was not metaphor here. It was flesh and bone, bruises hidden beneath the folds of wool. The novice slowed his steps, the basin trembling against his grip. His mind wandered to the village where he had been born, far from these high walls. He remembered the plague that had swept across it when he was still a child, remembered bells tolling without pause, the reek of lime pits where bodies were swallowed by earth. He had prayed for escape, prayed for light, for sanctuary. The monastery had seemed salvation, a place where death could be held at bay by prayer, where hunger could be exchanged for bread, where God's shadow might feel like shelter. But here, beneath painted saints whose faces were cracked and flaking, he felt a darker truth. The prayers he heard in choir were not always of mercy, but of submission. The chants stretched long into the night, not to banish fear, but to drown. The silence that cloaked the cloister was not the silence of heaven. It was the silence of men who dared not speak. He paused at the great door, unable to help himself. His fingers twitched as though they longed to reach for the iron ring, though he knew the cost of disobedience. A muffled voice rose within, not quite a scream, not quite a prayer, but the broken sound of both entwined. The novice's chest tightened, his eyes burning. He thought of the words he had been taught, that pain purifies, that the body must pay the price of the soul. Yet in his heart, doubt grew like a thorn. Could holiness share its breath with cruelty? Could God's grace live in the shadow of chains? He moved on, though his steps were unsteady, and carried the basin into the infirmary. The air was thick, with the scent of sweat, of fever, of herbs crushed into bitter paste. The sick lay sprawled on pallets of straw, their skins slick and pale, their lips cracked by thirst. A brother recited psalms, his voice low and weary, while another pressed damp cloths against trembling brows. The novice placed his basin down, and for a moment he dared to meet the eyes of a dying man. They were hollow, rimmed with red, yet in them burned the same question he carried within himself. Where is mercy and where is God? The candles sputtered, their wax dripping in slow rivulets, and the shadows swayed along the walls. Somewhere deeper within the monastery, a bell rang, not for prayer, not for death, but for penance. The sound throbbed through the stones, through the novice's bones, and he knew what it meant. Another brother was being brought to discipline. Another cry would join the echoes behind the iron door. He turned away quickly, clutching his robe against his chest, whispering words no one else would hear. Words that begged not for light, but for endurance. For he was bound here by vows, by duty, by the promise that obedience was the path to heaven. Yet as he stepped again into the corridor, his shadow long and wavering across the stones, he could not escape the thought that perhaps salvation was not found within these walls, but beyond them. Beyond the iron door, beyond the bell, beyond the silence that smothered the truth. The novice's breath caught as he glanced once more at the locked chamber. The cries had grown faint, slipping into quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. He lowered his head, forcing himself to move on, the basin now empty, his heart burdened with a weight that no chant could dissolve. The monastery loomed around him, its walls whispering obedience, its shadows hiding the cost of holiness. He walked, but in the back of his mind lingered the image of the iron tools, of the cries swallowed by stone, of the prayers twisted into chains, and though he did not yet know it, the doubts that now stirred within him would shape the course of his life, whether toward rebellion, toward exile, or toward a silence even more dangerous than the one that now ruled the cloister. Outside, the night deepened. Wind howled against the towers, carrying the faint sound of wolves across the hills. The monastery remained a fortress of stone and shadow, its bells poised to toll again. And in that waiting silence one could feel the gathering storm of a darker age, where faith itself would be tested not by prayer, but by fire. The market stirred long before the sun rose. Lanterns swung from wooden beams, their flames sputtering in the wind that swept through the square. Canvas tarps, soaked with last night's rain, were pulled back to reveal barrels of salted herring, baskets of onions and garlic, slabs of meat darkening where the butcher's blade had left them. The air was thick with contradictions. The Sweet smoke of roasting chestnuts mingled with the stench of blood and fish guts. The pungent reek of hide stretched on racks beside the tang of cheap wine spilled into the mud. The ground itself was slick, a patchwork of straw, refuse, and crimson smears where carts had already ground filth into the frozen earth. Amidst this tapestry of survival, a boy slipped between the stalls, his small frame darting quick as a sparrow, through the forest of legs and cloaks. He was no more than 12, ribs showing beneath his thin tunic, bare feet bruised by the frozen cobblestones. Clutched tight against his chest was a sack that bulged with stolen apples, their pale skins shining faintly in the lantern light. His breath came fast, clouds of white in the morning chill, his heartbeat loud as a drum inside his ears. He ran, not for mischief but for hunger, a hunger that had hollowed his belly for days, a hunger that made risk seem lighter than air. But in this place, the law was not merciful. The gallows loomed at the edge of the square, its timbers dark with dew, and with something deeper that never washed away. The rope hung limp, swaying slightly in the breeze, its fibers stiffened by use. Ravens had already gathered there, black shapes shifting and croaking, their wings flapping heavy as they waited for what they always waited for. The boy's eyes flickered toward it, and for a moment the sack of apples seemed heavier in his arms. For theft, the pillory. For theft again, the noose. And though he was but a child, the rope did not choose its victims kindly. He darted into a narrow alley, pressed his back against a wall damp with moss, and listened. Voices rang through the market, the hawkers calling out their goods, the clang of iron from a smith's cart, the low chant of a friar begging for alms. Yet above them all rose the toll of the church bells, their voices deep and commanding, summoning not just prayer but order, not just worship but judgment. The bells were the heartbeat of the town, and each note seemed to say the same thing. Nothing escapes the gaze of power. The boy's fingers trembled as he reached into the sack and pulled out one apple. Its skin was cold against his hand, its scent sharp and sweet in the air. He bit into it, juice running down his chin, the taste a flood of relief that seemed to fill him with warmth. For that moment, as his teeth tore into forbidden sweetness, he felt alive. Alive in a way that no sermon, no coin, no lash of law had ever made him feel. Yet the taste was fleeting, quickly followed by the weight of fear. For even as he chewed, he could hear boots slapping against the stones. "Thief!" someone muttered behind him, the word carrying more venom than hunger ever could. The boy pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his breath shallow, his body curled around the sack as though he could shield it with his very bones. He thought of the punishments he had seen. Men with heads shaved, hands bound in stocks, their faces smeared with rotten food hurled by the crowd. He thought of the pillory, the sharp crack of wood as the board closed around a neck, the jeers of children who threw stones instead of bread. And worse, he thought of the rope, the sudden silence when the stool was kicked away, the lifeless swing of legs against the dawn sky. He shivered not from the cold but from the memory of those sights etched into his young mind. Yet what choice did he have? Hunger left no room for honor. Hunger did not wait for permission. Hunger was the true law, one that bent every man and child alike. From the square, the voice of a magistrate rose, sharp and commanding, reading aloud some decree. Taxes for trade, penalties for theft, blessings for obedience. The boy knew those words were not meant for the poor like him. They were stones, and he was the earth they fell upon. He sank deeper into the alley, biting another apple, the sour juice stinging his tongue. He swallowed quickly, listening as the bells tolled again, louder now, echoing between the walls like a sentence already passed. He closed his eyes and pressed the apple core into the mud. In his mind he saw two images at once, the apple shining in his hand and the rope tightening around his neck. The morning light crept slowly into the square, turning the mist into a pale veil. Merchants set their wares, guards stamped their feet against the cold, children ran errands with baskets clutched in red hands. To them, this was the rhythm of life. But to the boy, crouched in the shadows, It was a theater of survival, where every breath risked exposure, every bite risked death. The gallows stood silently, patient as always. The ravens shifted, their black eyes glinting as though they alone knew how quickly hunger could turn a boy into a body swinging from the rope. The boy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, lifted the sack once more, and stepped cautiously from the alley. The world had already judged him. He felt it in every bell that tolled, in every shadow that lengthened across the square. Yet still he walked forward, because hunger left him no other path. And as he moved, blending again into the river of cloaks and carts and cries, the camera of the soul might linger not on him alone, but on the gallows behind him, the rope swaying, lightly, waiting for its next breath, its next neck, its next life, stolen not by hunger, but by the silence of judgment. The bells tolled again, deep and mournful. The day had only just begun.